Pick that up, sweetheart, nurses don't make diagnostic calls here. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 14 minutes before everything changed. Brooke Sullivan didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply turned back to her monitor, her jaw clenching once before her face went completely neutral. The chart he'd slapped against her scrubs hung there for 3 full seconds, the weight of his contempt made physical, before she caught it with one hand, the other already moving to adjust the fall line on bed 4. Around her, the residents laughed. The younger nurses looked away. Nobody stepped in. This was Seattle General's ER hierarchy in its purest form. Dr. Whitfield, 6'2", silver-haired, the kind of privilege that came wrapped in Armani suits and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, had made a public bet during morning rounds that she wouldn't last a week. The new transplant nurse who asked too many questions. The one who wanted to discuss differential diagnoses instead of following orders. He'd said it loud enough for the entire surgical team to hear, the same way he'd knocked her cafeteria tray onto the floor yesterday while his residents laughed, the same way he'd corrected her in front of 3 patients about a blood pressure reading she'd taken correctly to the millimeter. His voice carried across the Savannah Hospital's bustling corridor like a tank idling in a garage, low, threatening, absolutely certain of his dominance. But Brooke had learned how to disappear into compliance the way other women learned makeup. 7 years of it now. 7 years of civilian life, which meant civilian rules. Civilian humiliation. Civilian silence. She finished bed 4's vitals, BP stable, O2 saturation holding at 97%, and moved to the intake station where the paperwork for the John Doe was already stacking. Trauma Bay 3. Unconscious male, estimated mid-30s, found unresponsive near the old industrial district on 15th Avenue. No wallet. No phone. No identification. The EMTs had brought him in at 16:42 hours with a Glasgow Coma Scale score of 8, meaning he couldn't open his eyes, couldn't speak, couldn't follow commands. Just breathing. Just existing between the spaces of life and death where Brooke had spent most of her own life, though no one here could ever know that. She pulled on fresh gloves, the latex snapped like a gunshot in her hands, and began cataloguing his belongings. The triage nurse had bagged everything, a shredded tactical jacket that had once been tan, now dark with blood. Boot prints on the fabric suggested a fall from height or a serious impact. The stitching inside the collar bore markings that had been intentionally removed, worn edges where Velcro patches had been ripped away. Military. Definitely military. Probably army, based on the gear configuration. Brooke's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. She set the jacket aside and continued. Cargo pants, also tactical, the kind you don't buy at civilian retailers. Steel-toed boots, laced with precision, the kind that remembered marching across desert compounds and through mountain passes. A watch, not fancy, but built to survive and function, a Garmin designed for navigation in places where GPS was unreliable and death was patient. Then her fingers found them. Dog tags. Tangled in the folds of his bloody shirt, the metal edges still warm from his body. She lifted them slowly, watching the chain catch the fluorescent light, and read the embossed letters. Her name stared back at her. B. Sullivan. The letters blurred once before Brooke focused, breathing through her nose the way she'd been trained, slow, methodical, controlled. Not a reaction. Nothing. Just processing data the way a trauma surgeon processes vital signs. The next line was a serial number. The military branch. And underneath, in smaller text, Baghdad. Baghdad. 7 years ago. Operation Sapphire. The field hospital outside Fallujah, Jolan district. The extraction that had gone sideways when the mortar hit it for 23 hours, when she'd been pulling an army ranger out of the rubble with shrapnel still falling like rain. His name had been on her roster, but not anymore. Operation Sapphire had been officially erased. The Navy had buried everything, classified, confidential, never happened. All of it. The tactical insertions, the combat medic work, the 47 missions logged and documented and filed away in a basement at the Pentagon where only ghosts could access them. She was supposed to have disappeared. Officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan didn't exist. There was only this version, the nurse in scrubs, the quiet woman who asked questions during rounds and took Whitfield's contempt without flinching because she couldn't afford to fight back. Fighting back meant surfacing. Surfacing meant the classified orders that had sent her into civilian life would be violated. It meant exposing the operation. It meant destroying the people who'd ordered the erasure in the first place. Brooke slipped the dog tags into her scrubs pocket, next to her pen and her badge. The metal settled against her ribs, still warm, still wrong. She walked to Trauma Bay 3 without consciously deciding to walk there. The unconscious man lay on the stretcher, tubes already placed, monitors tracking his vital signs like electronic confessionals. His face was partially covered by an oxygen mask, his jaw set even in unconsciousness. Dark hair, probably black before the dust settled in it. A scar along his left temple, old, healed, the kind of scar that comes from surviving something most people don't survive. Brooke had given him that scar. She'd put pressure on the wound when the mortar fragmentation had torn open his scalp in the field hospital, her hands moving on muscle memory while rounds screamed past and the ceiling came down in pieces. She'd elevated his leg to stop the bleeding when the shrapnel had caught his thigh. She'd counted his heartbeats, fast, then faster, then slowing toward the terrible quiet that meant death was winning, while she fought it with every piece of herself. When the extraction order came through, she'd carried him 400 meters to the waiting Black Hawk, the rotor wash nearly blowing her sideways, blood trailing behind them like a marker. And at the field hospital, when the dust was finally settling and he was stabilized and sedated, he'd pressed his boots into her hands. Combat boots, worn soft with use, still holding the shape of his feet. "Keep these," he'd said, his voice hoarse, his eyes unfocused with morphine. "Give them back when we meet again." That's a promise. She'd kept that promise the only way she could. The boots had been wrapped in canvas for 7 years, hidden at the bottom of her locker underneath the lock she changed every month. She'd moved apartments 14 times. She'd changed her hair, changed her name officially on every civilian document, changed the way she walked and talked and existed so completely that sometimes she forgot what it felt like to be the person who'd stood in that field hospital. And now he was here. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, REM sleep, or the restlessness of trauma, or maybe something deeper. His monitors showed elevated heart rate, 110 beats per minute, climbing slightly. His oxygen saturation was solid at 98%, but his blood pressure was running high. 159/94. Higher than it should be, given the sedation. Tension in the system. Pain that the morphine wasn't quite blocking. Brooke was still watching his cardiac monitor when Dr. Whitfield appeared in the bay doorway, chart in hand, his presence making the air pressure change in ways that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. "How long has he been tachycardic?" she asked quietly. Neutral voice. The voice of someone who'd learned to ask questions in a way that didn't sound like asking questions. "His vitals are stable," Whitfield said, not looking at her. He was scanning the monitors with the kind of cursory attention a surgeon gives to machines he doesn't trust. "Sedation's appropriate. We'll get imaging when he's more stable." "His BP's climbing," Brooke said. Still quiet. Still deferential. Still the nurse in her lane. 159/94. That's a 9-point rise in the last 8 minutes. The tachycardia's tracking with it. Whitfield turned to look at her now. His eyes were the color of glacier ice, and about as warm. "Are you diagnosing, Nurse Sullivan?" "Because that would be my job." He said her name like a curse. Like something he'd scraped off his shoe. "No, sir," Brooke said. She didn't look away. That was one of her tells. If she looked away too quickly, people knew something was wrong. So she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before turning back to adjust the fall line on the ranger's left arm. Her hands were steady. The trembling came later, always later, when she was alone with the boots. "Just observation." "Observation should go through the proper channels," Whitfield said. He was already walking away, confident in the way men with power are confident. "Continue monitoring. Call me if anything changes." He didn't wait for confirmation. He never did. Brooke stayed at the ranger's bedside for another 23 seconds, watching the monitors track his heartbeat. 112 now. Still climbing. Still wrong. The elevated pressures could indicate any number of things: pain, stress response, internal bleeding, cardiac tamponade developing. The oxygen was good, so it wasn't a pulmonary issue. The breathing was steady, so it wasn't respiratory distress. But something was wrong in the spaces between his ribs, in the chambers of his heart, in the thin fluid that surrounded it like armor. She could feel it. Muscle memory wasn't just the ability to execute procedures. It was the ability to read patients the way soldiers read terrain. 12 years in field medicine, 14 years in tactical support operations, had taught her that the body always spoke the truth if you listened in the right language. But she couldn't tell Whitfield that. Couldn't pull him back and insist. Couldn't defend her clinical instinct without surfacing, without admitting she'd been trained in ways that reached far beyond any nursing school curriculum. Nurses didn't spend 47 combat missions keeping soldiers alive. Nurses didn't know how to read a cardiac tamponade developing before the monitors screamed about it. Nurses didn't carry combat boots in their lockers as proof that someone had made them a promise they'd kept for 7 years. She stepped away from the monitor and walked back to her station, the dog tag settled heavy against her ribs. The afternoon shift was starting to build, more trauma coming in, the ER beginning its nightly surge. Somewhere beyond the doors, paramedics were running cold, the sirens already wailing in the distance like something hunting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the man in Trauma Bay 3 with the elevated cardiac pressure and the unknown injuries was going to get worse before anyone else noticed. The worst part was the absolute certainty that Whitfield would miss something critical because he needed to be right more than he needed the patient to be saved. The worst part was understanding that Brooke couldn't help him, couldn't use the skills that had kept him alive once before, because staying invisible was the price she'd paid to stay alive herself. She pulled up the ranger's file on the computer, watching his vital signs update in real time. The pressure was still climbing. A nurse named Patterson called her over to help with a patient admission 3 minutes later. The ranger's monitors continued their steady escalation in the background, a conversation happening in numbers that only one person in the hospital could truly understand, and she was being kept far enough away that she could only watch and wait and pretend her expertise didn't exist. In her pocket, the dog tag sat warm against her heart, a promise being broken in real time. The dog tag sat warm against her heart as Brooke Sullivan finished the overnight census, the weight of them a constant reminder of the man breathing in Trauma Bay 3 and the 7 years of silence between them. Morning rounds wouldn't start for another hour, but Dr. Whitfield was already moving through the ER like a man who owned it, his white coat pristine, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. 8 residents trailed behind him in a loose formation, their notepads ready, their eyes hungry for the kind of teaching moment that Whitfield specialized in, the kind that humiliated people. He stopped at the main station, directly in front of Brooke. She didn't look up from her charting. "I give the new girl a week before she quits," Whitfield announced, his tone light, conversational. "Any takers?" 2 residents immediately pulled out their wallets, already calculating odds. Brooke's pen continued moving across the chart, her handwriting steady as a laser. She could feel the attention shifting toward her like a spotlight, the weight of 8 sets of eyes waiting to see if she would react, would blush, would show anything at all. "Transplant nurses think they're special because they've seen a little trauma," Whitfield continued, his voice pitching toward performance now. "But Seattle General has standards." He smiled at his residents like they were in on a joke. "We don't let just anyone practice medicine in Savannah." The silence that followed was the kind that felt deliberately constructed. Brooke turned the page of her chart. She could have said something. Part of her, the part that had spent 7 years learning to be invisible, wanted to say something. But the other part, the part that had sat in a Baghdad field hospital with mortar rounds shaking the tent walls while she kept her hand steady enough to save a man's life, knew that engagement was exactly what he wanted. She turned another page. Kept charting. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head, indifferent to the dynamics playing out below. Whitfield waited 3 seconds, then lost interest. Real dominance, he seemed to believe, didn't require a response. By noon, Brooke had taken her lunch to the cafeteria's back corner, a table by the windows where the afternoon light turned the clouds gold and the noise of the kitchen faded to something manageable. She was halfway through her pasta when Whitfield appeared, his tray balanced with the casual confidence of a man who had never worried about dropping it. His residents formed a protective semicircle around him, their presence a wall between him and the rest of the cafeteria. "Oh, sweetheart," Whitfield said, his voice dropping to something almost kind, almost fatherly. "Nurses sit at the other tables. We keep professional boundaries here." Brooke set down her fork. She didn't argue. She simply stood, preparing to move, and that's when Whitfield's arm jerked slightly, a motion that could have been clumsy, could have been accidental, the kind of thing that happened in busy cafeterias all the time. Except it wasn't. His tray caught hers with the precision of a man who had practiced the gesture in his mind before executing it. Sweet tea spread across the table like spilled blood. Pasta scattered across the tile floor. A piece of garlic bread landed near her shoe. The sound of breaking ceramics cut through the cafeteria's general noise, and suddenly every conversation stopped. The moment crystallized. This was the point where the hierarchy asserted itself. Laughter rippled outward from his residence like a contagion, spreading to other tables, other doctors, other people who understood the unspoken language of professional humiliation. Brooke knelt without hesitation, without comment, her movements deliberate and controlled. She began picking up each piece of pasta individually, stacking the broken ceramic carefully, her hands moving with the same precision she used in crisis situations. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook. Whitfield watched for exactly 10 seconds, then turned away, his purpose served. She disposed of the mess herself, returned her tray to the window, and left the cafeteria without looking back. The other nurses watched her go with the kind of expression reserved for people who had already been determined to be expendable. That afternoon, the ranger's cardiac status began trending wrong. Brooke noticed it first because she was watching him the way combat medics watch dying patients, with the kind of attention that catches the subtle shifts no monitor alarm can predict. His jugular venous distension had increased. His peripheral perfusion was slipping. The echo from morning rounds had shown something concerning, something Whitfield had dismissed with a wave of his hand because maintaining hierarchy was more important than following the data. She approached him in the ER hallway at shift change, the busiest possible moment, when maximum staff would be present to witness the interaction. It wasn't strategic on her part, it was simply the moment the data demanded attention. "Doctor, his cardiac pressures are trending wrong. The echo shows possible effusion. I think we should consider a repeat imaging." Whitfield was reviewing another patient's chart, surrounded by 3 residents who were learning that authority meant never having to listen to floor nurses. He didn't look up when she spoke. He simply raised his hand, grabbed the patient chart from her grip, and slapped it against her scrubs with enough force to scatter papers across the hallway like leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the entire corridor. "Nurses don't make diagnostic calls here. You read numbers. I interpret them." The hallway froze. This wasn't a private moment. This was a performance, and everyone understood it. Staff members stopped mid-stride. 2 orderlies exchanged glances. The charge nurse looked away, the complicated look of someone witnessing institutional power and knowing there was nothing to be done about it. "Unless you went to medical school when I wasn't looking," Whitfield added, turning to his residents with a smile that invited them to join the audience. "That would be a hell of a secret." They laughed. That was the really important part, the laughter, the validation from peers, the confirmation that this was entertainment, not cruelty. The laughter made it acceptable. Brooke's jaw clenched once. A small motion, barely visible. She maintained eye contact with Whitfield for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register that she had heard him, brief enough to offer no invitation for further engagement. Then she knelt and began gathering the scattered papers with methodical precision. Her movements were calm. Her face revealed nothing. She collected every sheet, stacked them in order, and returned to her station where the monitors beat their steady rhythm and no one could hurt anyone just by talking. The shift continued. She took vitals. She charted. She moved through the hours like a ghost, present but untouched, doing the work that kept patients alive while the hierarchy above her played its games. But that night, after the day shift had left and the evening crew had settled into their stations, she found herself in the supply closet restocking for tubing, and her hands finally remembered how to feel. She gripped the edge of the metal shelf until her knuckles went white, her breathing controlled and measured even as the rage moved through her like electricity. The dog tags in her pocket felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She closed her eyes and counted her breaths the way the survival instructors at Fort Bragg had taught her 17 years ago, the way that separated soldiers from civilians, composure from breakdown. 30 seconds. 60 seconds. 120. By the time she opened her eyes, the moment had passed. She had won nothing. She had proven nothing. She had simply survived another hour of being underestimated, and tomorrow there would be more. She didn't know, as she left the supply closet and returned to her charting, that survival was about to end. She didn't know that at 0300 hours, the ranger's cardiac status would make the decision for her, would force her hand in a way that no amount of composure could contain, would demand that the nurse in Trauma Bay 3 stop being invisible and start being what she actually was. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next didn't just change the hospital's understanding of who Brooke Sullivan was. What happened next would bring the Pentagon calling. The monitors told the story in beeps and numbers. Brooke's eyes snapped to the screens at 0300 hours, BP dropping from 94 systolic to 72. Heart rate climbing from 118 to 147. The patterns weren't random. They were a signature. Jugular venous distension. Muffled heart sounds when she'd listened an hour earlier. Pulses paradoxus, blood pressure dropping on inspiration like a closing fist. Her hands went cold. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid crushing the heart from the outside, suffocating it with every squeeze. The ranger's eyes were half closed, breathing shallow. His skin had gone the color of old cement. Brooke moved to the phone at the nurse's station, her fingers steady as she dialed the attending's direct line. The phone rang. Rang again. Rang a third time before the automated message, "You've reached Dr. Whitfield's voicemail. Please leave a message." She hung up and tried the overhead page. Dr. Whitfield, code blue, Trauma Bay 3. Dr. Whitfield, code blue, Trauma Bay 3. Nothing. She tried his cell. Straight to voicemail. The ER charge nurse, Sandra, glanced over from the medication cart. "He left an hour ago. Said he was going home to sleep, not to bother him unless someone was actively coding." Brooke's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then nothing showed. She turned back to the monitors. BP 68. Dropping. The ranger's fingers twitched. His eyes rolled slightly beneath closed lids. 47 seconds until his pressure would bottom out completely. After that, cardiac arrest. She moved before thinking. Muscle memory didn't require permission. Her feet carried her to the crash cart and she grabbed the ultrasound probe, a portable bedside unit, nothing like the surgical bays with their full-size machines. She knew exactly what she'd find. The echocardiography would show the pericardial effusion, the dark fluid surrounding the heart like a noose tightening. But she didn't have time for confirmation imaging. Confirmation was a luxury for patients who could wait. She moved to the ranger's bedside and pulled the curtain. The rain hammered against the ER windows like bullets on asphalt, each drop a small percussion of time running out. The needle hung between her fingers, 18-gauge catheter, cold and ready. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing wasn't elevated. She'd done this in a field hospital in Fallujah with mortar rounds impacting the roof, concrete dust falling like snow, standing over a Marine whose heart was drowning in its own fluid. She'd done this in the back of a UH-60 Blackhawk while the rotor wash shook the entire airframe. This was Seattle General Hospital. Fluorescent lights. Climate control. A full surgical team 12 seconds away. This was easier. She located the fifth intercostal space, midclavicular line. Exactly where the textbooks said. Exactly where her hands already knew. She swabbed the skin with iodine, or the smell sharp and chemical, biting. Her fingers found the landmarks, the angle of his ribs, the space where bone didn't block the needle's path. She'd explained this procedure to herself 100 times since Baghdad, understanding the anatomy so completely that her body had become the procedure. The needle entered at a 45-degree angle, moving toward the patient's left shoulder. She could feel the resistance of tissue, then the subtle give as the needle penetrated the pericardial membrane. The first drops of fluid were dark. Burgundy. The color of old blood and infection. She kept the needle steady, any tremor would perforate the heart itself. The fluid flowed through the catheter like opening a pressurized valve. Hiss of air escaping. The monitors showed it immediately. BP climbing. 78, 84. 92, the heart was expanding again, no longer suffocated. The ranger gasped like he was surfacing from deep water. His eyes opened, vacant, unseeing, consciousness somewhere else entirely, and his hand grabbed at the oxygen mask with the panic of a drowning man. Shush, Brooke whispered, though he couldn't hear her. Couldn't understand. The muscle relaxant from his sedation was still in his system. You're okay. Heart's breathing again. She kept draining the fluid, watching the monitors climb toward normal range. 102 systolic. 118, the heart rate settled from 147 to 89. Normal. Beautiful. Normal. She secured the catheter with tape and stepped back from the bed, pulling off her gloves with deliberate slowness. The wet latex snapped against the trash can like gunshots in the silence. 20 minutes passed. The ranger's color improved from cement to flesh tone. His oxygen saturation climbed from 87% to 98%. The ventilator wheezed its steady mechanical rhythm, doing the breathing for him while his body recovered what should have been a fatal event. Brooke stood at the bedside and did nothing else. Just watched. Just made sure the numbers stayed right. The dog tags hung at her neck under her scrubs, the one she'd found tangled in his bloody shirt, and she'd been carrying them like a secret, like a promise. Like the one he'd made to her in Baghdad when she'd pressed those boots into his hands, come back when the world makes sense again. Give these back to me when we're both standing in the same room and nobody's shooting at us. She should have paged someone. Should have documented. Should have called for help immediately upon recognizing the tamponade. She did none of those things. She'd used her hands instead, and her hands had worked the way they always did, like they'd been designed for this exact moment across 7 years and 6,000 miles. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. The worst part arrived at 0847 in the form of Dr. Whitfield walking past Trauma Bay 3 and seeing the documentation in the electronic chart. Pericardiocentesis. Fluid drainage. Vital stabilization. Performed by staff nurse. Not by him. Not even under physician supervision, the medical record showed she'd been alone. His face didn't show anger. It showed something colder, calculation. The kind of look a man gets when he realizes someone has challenged his authority in front of the entire hospital system. By 10:30, Brooke's badge stopped working at the ER entrance. She tapped it twice, 3 times. Nothing. The door stayed locked. A security officer she'd never seen before appeared from the hallway, his expression blank and professional. Brooke Sullivan? She didn't answer because her name wasn't a question. I'm going to need you to come with me. She followed him through the corridors she'd been walking for 3 months, past the nurse's station where Sandra was staring very carefully at her computer, past the waiting room where 2 families watched a muted television without really seeing it. The security officer held the door to a conference room on the administrative floor. The lighting was the color of despair, fluorescent and sterile. The HR director sat at the table with a file already open. Her name was Patricia Chen and she'd smiled when Brooke arrived on day 1. She wasn't smiling now. Please sit. Brooke Saturday. The chair was uncomfortable in a way that seemed intentional. We're conducting an investigation into your conduct during the night shift. Specifically, your performance of a medical procedure, pericardiocentesis, without physician oversight. That constitutes practicing medicine without a license. It's a criminal matter, not just a hospital matter. The patient would have died, Brooke said quietly. That's not your determination to make. You're a registered nurse, not a physician. Dr. Whitfield has documented this incident, along with a pattern of insubordination. Refusing direct orders. Making diagnostic claims that are outside your scope. Undermining the attending physician's authority. Patricia slid a stack of papers across the table. Each one was an incident report Brooke had never seen before. Your credential background is unusual. These references, these phone numbers don't connect to actual facilities. Your employment history has gaps. Your nursing school records show basic competency, but your technical skills are significantly beyond your documented training. An investigator sat in the corner, the kind of person who makes a living asking questions that don't have safe answers. He leaned forward slightly. Where did you actually learn to perform cardiac procedures? Brooke's hands rested flat on the table. I can't discuss that. Can't or won't? Both. The investigator and Patricia exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that made decisions. Your credentials are suspended effective immediately, pending full investigation. You're not to return to patient care areas. You'll clear your locker within the hour under security supervision. Patricia pulled out a form. You'll need to sign this acknowledgement of. I understand, Brooke interrupted. The first time she'd spoken without being asked a question. The security officer walked her to the locker room. Her locker was on the third shelf of the third row. Inside were the things civilian Brooke Sullivan had accumulated: an extra pair of compression socks, a bottle of ibuprofen, a half-eaten granola bar, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, a pair of worn combat boots. Black leather, laces grey with dust, the right sole separating slightly at the heel. A soldier's boots. The ranger's boots. She'd kept them hidden for 7 years, waiting for a moment that made no sense in any civilian context. Waiting for a reason to surface, to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't, to stop believing the Navy's lie that Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had ceased to exist. She wrapped them back in the t-shirt and placed them in the paper bag the security officer held out. Everything civilian. Everything she'd borrowed. Nothing here was actually hers anymore. The walk to the parking lot took 43 seconds. The rain was beginning to slow, the hammering reduced to a steady patter that smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. Her car was a 2014 Honda Civic, practical and forgettable. She sat in the driver's seat with the paper bag on the passenger side and didn't start the engine. Just Saturday. The dog tags under her scrubs felt heavier than physics suggested possible. The ones with her operational call sign would stay here. The ones bearing his name were still in her pocket where they'd been since she'd found them tangled in his bloody shirt, evidence of a life that had existed before his body broke and his mind vanished into sedation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that by saving his life, she'd guaranteed her own destruction. The Pentagon had ordered her invisible. The Navy had demanded silence. Any surface of her true identity violated the terms of a ghost operation that had never officially happened. And she'd just used classified tactical training in a modern hospital while her badge was recorded on security cameras, while her movements were documented in electronic charts, while the entire event existed in the permanent medical record of a major civilian hospital. She'd chosen his life over her own erasure. And there was no taking that back. No unlearning what her hands had just done. No explaining why a nurse knew how to perform emergency field surgery without killing the patient. No answer to give them except silence. The kind of silence that makes investigators suspicious. The kind of silence that gets people noticed by the wrong agencies in Washington. She turned the key. The engine started. The wipers crossed the windshield once, twice, 3 times, pushing away the rain. Somewhere in Trauma Bay 3, an Army Ranger was breathing. His heart was beating. His monitors showed normal sinus rhythm. And a Master Chief Petty Officer who officially didn't exist had just become very visible. By 0800 hours, Dr. Whitfield was already working the phones in his private office on the 4th floor. His fraternity brother, Marcus Chen, sat on the hospital board's executive committee, a useful connection cultivated over 17 years of country club lunches and confidential favors. Whitfield's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Marcus, we have a serious liability situation. New transplant nurse, barely a week in, performing unauthorized procedures without attending physician oversight. Cardiac intervention. Could have killed the patient." The lie wrapped itself in just enough truth to be credible. Chen asked the obvious question. Whitfield responded with practiced concern, "I'm worried about her judgment. Reckless confidence. We need to protect the hospital's accreditation status." By 0830, the phone calls had already been made to her nursing school in Portland, her previous employer in Tacoma, references she'd listed on her original application. Whitfield had prepared the narrative carefully. Each call followed the same pattern: sincere concern about her erratic judgment, questions about her training gaps, subtle implications that something about her credentials didn't quite add up. 3 of her 4 references confirmed they'd received his inquiries. One reference, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Harborview Medical Center, actually called Brooke's phone while Brooke was in the break room, leaving a voicemail that trembled with confusion. "Brooke, someone's asking strange questions about your field experience and your military background. What's going on?" Brooke didn't call her back. She couldn't. The questions came from a place she couldn't legally enter. By 0900, an HR investigator named Patricia Goines arrived at Seattle General carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of neutral expression that made bad outcomes feel inevitable. She'd been doing this work for 12 years, investigating staff complaints, documenting procedural violations, building cases for termination. Whitfield had already prepared her briefing package. 3 inches of documentation, resident statements about Brooke's inappropriate confidence in clinical decision-making, photos of her facial expression during the Rangers crisis marked up with annotations like "shows concerning detachment," her personnel file flagged with a handwritten note, "pattern of insubordination." Goines conducted the formal interview in a small conference room on the 2nd floor at 1015 hours. Brooke sat across from her, hands folded on the table, her posture military straight. Goines read directly from Whitfield's report, "You performed a pericardiocentesis without explicit attending physician authorization. You were paged. You did not wait for a response. You made a diagnostic call and took surgical action independently." The words hung in the fluorescent silence. Brooke's jaw clenched once. The patient's tamponade was crushing his cardiac output. Pressures were, she stopped herself. What was the point? To defend herself meant explaining how she knew exactly where to place the needle, how her hands had moved through the procedure with the kind of precision that comes from doing it on bleeding soldiers in a Baghdad field hospital, not from nursing school lectures. It meant exposing herself. "I see," Goines said, writing in her notebook. "And you felt qualified to make that determination independent of the attending physician." Not a question. The pen kept moving. Brooke understood then what was happening. This wasn't an investigation meant to uncover truth. It was a theater production designed to document predetermined conclusions. Goines conducted the interview for another 17 minutes, asking questions she already had answers to, writing down responses before Brooke finished speaking. By 10:45, the meeting was over. "Your credentials are being suspended pending a formal hearing, scheduled for 1600 hours today. You'll be advised of our findings and given an opportunity to respond." Goines used the word opportunity the way people use it when they've already decided your fate. At 11:40, Whitfield's office called Brooke to inform her of the suspension. Her credentials would be deactivated at noon. She was not to access patient files, not to perform clinical duties, not to enter restricted areas without supervision. She had until 1400 hours to clear her locker. The timing was surgical precision, clear her personal space before the hearing, before she could mount any defense, before the narrative became anything other than what Whitfield had written. Brooke walked to the staff locker room in the basement at 1355 hours. The laundry room was adjacent, separated by a single door that swung both ways. She gathered her 5 sets of scrubs from her locker and carried them to the industrial folding counter, moving with the methodical precision of someone completing a ritual. Each set was folded into military corners, tight creases, symmetrical edges, corners folded with ruler straight angles. She wasn't a nurse folding work clothes. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer conducting a ceremony. The scrubs stacked in a neat pile, each one a day of pretending, a day of answering to honeys and sweetie, a day of absorbing insults without response because breaking composure meant breaking cover. 5 days of civilian identity, folded into a stack that would fit in a cardboard box. She placed her name badge next to them, B. Sullivan, RN, and looked at the laminated photo. 28 years old in that picture. That was 4 years ago. She looked older now. Different eyes. The eyes of someone who'd been hiding. Then she opened her locker one final time. Behind her extra shoes, stuffed deep against the back wall, wrapped carefully in canvas and layers of tissue paper, were the boots. Combat boots, size 11, scuffed tan leather with a red dust that never quite washed out no matter how hard she'd tried. They weren't hers. They belonged to Specialist Jake Garrett, call sign Wrench, the Army Ranger she'd carried through Baghdad streets while rounds snapped past her head like angry wasps. He'd been hit in the lower abdomen, bleeding through his vest, his voice already thin and reedy as she hauled him into a carry position. "Don't drop me, Valkyrie," he'd whispered. His weight was impossible, 220 pounds of dead weight, his legs not working, her own wound screaming through the adrenaline, but she'd moved. Step after step. 400 meters to the evac helicopter. His hands had clutched at her shoulders, and before they'd loaded him, before the rotors had lifted him away, he'd pressed his boots into her hands. "Bring these back to me when we get out. Bring them back so I know you made it." She'd promised. She'd promised a 23-year-old man bleeding out in the middle of a combat zone that she would survive and return his boots to him someday. That someday had been 7 years of waiting. And now he was here. Alive. Awake. In a wheelchair 2 floors above her. She held the boots against her chest, her eyes still dry, her breathing still controlled, but something in her chest fractured exactly along the line of where she'd taken shrapnel that day. The boots carried the weight of a promise, the memory of a body, the ghost of every person she couldn't save when she was the only one left standing. She wrapped them carefully back in the canvas and placed them in her personal duffel bag with her civilian clothes, the clothes she'd worn to interviews, the clothes she'd worn for 7 years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her phone buzzed at 1342 hours. A text from Marcus, her 17-year-old son. "Mom, where are you? Your principal called. Said you're in trouble." She stared at the message for 3 seconds before responding, "It's fine. Going to be late tonight." She typed another message, a longer one explaining that she'd been fired, that she was sorry, that none of this was his fault, and then deleted it. Some truths required conversation, not text messages. Some truths required a level of explanation she wasn't ready to give. By 1400 hours, Brooke had cleared her locker completely. The boots, the scrubs, the name badge, the small framed photo of Marcus from when he was 8 years old, everything fit into a single duffel bag. She set it on the bench and looked at the empty locker, the metal interior reflecting fluorescent light back at her like a mirror showing a space where something used to be. The locker room hummed with the low electrical frequency of power and decay, the sound of institutions grinding through their ordinary business. She closed the door, and it locked with a solid metal click that echoed through the empty room. She was dressed now in her street clothes, jeans, a dark blue hoodie, a pair of regular shoes that were nothing like combat boots. A civilian woman, rendered invisible by her ordinariness. Upstairs, in the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor, Dr. Whitfield was arranging his 3-inch binder of documentation, preparing to present his case to the hospital board. The hearing was scheduled for 1600 hours. By then, he calculated, Brooke Sullivan would have collected herself, acknowledged her failures, and resigned before he was forced to recommend termination. He'd seen it 100 times before. Nurses without backbone always folded when faced with official paperwork. The ones with actual training, with actual military discipline, were usually smart enough to understand when they'd been outmaneuvered. He didn't know that the woman he'd been bullying had carried a bleeding soldier through a war zone. He didn't know that she'd made promises to ghosts. He didn't know that the man in the hospital bed 2 floors above him had been dreaming about her face for 7 years, waiting for boots that never came back. What Whitfield knew was that he'd prepared his narrative, activated his network, and executed a plan that would remove a threat to his authority before she could become a greater liability. He'd done it all before. He was good at it. He had no way of knowing that everything he'd built in the last 18 hours was about to collapse in the next 2 hours. That at 1600, when the hearing room doors opened, his entire career was walking through them. The hearing room doors burst open at 1547 hours. Marcus Sullivan pushed through first, his 17-year-old frame moving with purpose he'd inherited from his mother, clutching a shadow box against his chest like a shield. The medals caught the fluorescent light, bronze, silver, gold, each one reflecting off the polished glass in tiny bursts of color. His voice shook, but his hands didn't. Mom said not to bring these. She said to keep quiet. She was wrong about that part. Dr. Whitfield's face went pale. Not because of the medals. Because of what they represented. Because the room suddenly understood that everything he'd spent 18 hours destroying was still standing, and it was about to walk toward him. The ranger was wheeled in next. Staff Sergeant David Chen, now conscious and alive, his dark eyes fixed on the hospital board members with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing you almost didn't get a second chance. The 4 lines traced up his arms. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. And his voice, when it came, was soft but it carried like artillery, Valkyrie 6. The room went dead silent. Not confusion. Recognition. The board chairman's pen stopped moving. General Morrison, who'd been standing near the back in his dress blues, stepped forward. Valkyrie 6. That wasn't a name. That was an operational call sign. That was someone who didn't exist on paper but very much existed in classified files, and the Pentagon had spent the last 48 hours looking for her. Master Chief Sullivan. The general's voice was steel-wrapped in authority. He was a 2-star, which meant decades of service, which meant he knew exactly who she was before he walked into this room. I've spent the last 2 days locating you after facial recognition flagged your hospital badge in our database. We've been searching for 7 years. He held a file folder, the kind with a red security stripe across the front. The kind that made lawyers nervous. The kind that made career administrators understand they were suddenly standing in water far deeper than they'd anticipated. Before we proceed, I need to read your official military record into this hearing. For the record. For everyone present to understand exactly who they're dealing with. He opened the folder. His eye scanned the first page. 3 silver stars. 1 Navy Cross. 47 combat missions as a flight medic and tactical operator. Commendations for valor under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Each medal got its own beat. Each one landed like a gavel. You carried a wounded soldier 400 meters under active mortar fire while sustaining critical injuries. You performed emergency cardiac procedures in field hospitals without supplies. You saved lives every single day for 12 years, and then you were ordered to disappear. To become a civilian. To vanish from all records. He looked directly at Whitfield. And this man called you sweetheart in a hallway yesterday. The ranger pulled up his sleeve. His left forearm bore a tattoo, faded but unmistakable. B. Sullivan inked in military standard font, surrounded by coordinates and a date. Baghdad. 7 years ago. I was 19 when shrapnel came through the wall of that FOB, Chen said quietly. A mortar landed 10 meters from our position. I felt her move in front of me. I felt the impact hit her instead of me. She didn't scream. She didn't stop working. She just kept her hand steady and got me on that helicopter, and then she collapsed on the tarmac. His voice cracked slightly. She carried me 400 meters through open ground with shrapnel in her back and a sucking chest wound. So when this man told her she wasn't qualified to make medical decisions, he was talking to someone who'd kept my heart beating when it should have stopped. She knew I was going into cardiac tamponade before any monitor told her. That's not insubordination. That's muscle memory from 7 years of keeping people alive when the alternative was watching them die. The board chairman's jaw moved once. Twice. Then he set down his pen and looked directly at Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield, you will surrender your hospital credentials effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full review of your conduct, your treatment of staff, and your fitness to practice medicine. The words came out flat, final, the way a judge pronounces a sentence. Whitfield stood up, his face the color of old rust. This is completely, I followed protocol. I documented everything. You violated the Hippocratic Oath, the general interrupted. You suspended her for saving a patient's life using skills earned through 3 Silver Stars and a Navy Cross. That's not protocol. That's ego. That's a man who needed to be right more than he needed to let a woman do her job. But that wasn't the worst part for Whitfield. The real destruction came 72 hours later when a resident who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident, the one where Whitfield knocked Brooke's tray to the floor and the other doctors laughed, decided to post phone video to a military subreddit. 12 seconds of footage. Whitfield's hand connecting with the tray. Brooke kneeling to pick up food from the tile floor. Residents laughing in the background. The video title, Doctor Humiliates Nurse at Seattle General. Turns out she's a Navy Master Chief with a Navy Cross. 2 million views in 36 hours. The comment section was a war zone. Someone identified Whitfield by name. Someone else dug up his CV. Someone found his medical school mentor, Dr. Raymond Foster, retired Navy surgeon, decorated Vietnam veteran, the man who'd trained Whitfield and vouched for him throughout his entire career. Dr. Foster saw the video at 0600 on a Tuesday morning. By 0800, he'd released a public statement that went viral almost as fast as the original footage. I trained Dr. Whitfield and personally recommended him to Seattle General. I am ashamed beyond words. His behavior toward Master Chief Sullivan represents everything I spent my career fighting against, a hierarchy of ego prioritized over human decency, a system where rank matters more than competence, where a man's feelings are protected while a woman's sacrifice is mocked. I hereby publicly disown him and recommend the medical board review his fitness to practice. He is no longer welcome at any institution where I have influence. The hospital's board accelerated its investigation. They interviewed every staff member Whitfield had managed. 8 formal complaints emerged, buried in files, dismissed as difficult staff, never escalated because Whitfield had connections. 6 patients requested different physicians, their concerns marked as demanding and filed away. The fraternity brother on the board suddenly remembered prior commitments and recused himself. Within 2 weeks, the board concluded that Dr. Whitfield had created a hostile work environment, violated professional conduct standards, prioritized institutional hierarchy over patient safety, and fostered a culture of intimidation. His privileges were permanently revoked. His contract terminated for cause. His name circulated through hospital networks as someone not to hire. His career wasn't suspended. It was over. 6 months later, Brooke walked past a strip mall on the way to work at the Savannah VA hospital. The insurance kiosk was wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, the kind of place where people sold other people things they didn't want to buy. Dr. Whitfield sat at a folding table, cheap laminate, the kind that wobbled if you leaned too hard, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo embroidered on the chest. His brochures were spread out in neat rows. His pen was clipped to a clipboard. His eyes lifted as she passed. Recognition first. Then shame. It lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked down, pretending to shuffle papers with the intensity of a man reorganizing his entire life into smaller and smaller piles. Brooke didn't slow her pace. She didn't change expression. She simply continued walking, and the distance between them grew until the insurance kiosk was just another storefront she'd passed on the way to somewhere that mattered. In her new office at the VA hospital, the ranger's worn combat boots sat on a shelf beside a framed photograph. Both of them in Baghdad, Brooke in full tactical gear, Chen grinning despite bandages, both of them alive. The boots were finally returned. The promise made in a field hospital 7 years ago was finally kept. They weren't just objects anymore. They were proof that some promises take years to honor but are always worth the wait. Marcus stopped by after school wearing his ROTC uniform, watching his mother train a young corpsman on emergency cardiac procedures. In the field, Brooke told the corpsman, "You don't wait for permission to save a life. You trust your training and you act. Hierarchy is a luxury. Patients don't care about your rank." Staff Sergeant Chen visited monthly for physical therapy. Today he brought his daughter, 8 years old, who stared at the shadow box mounted on the office wall like it contained something sacred. "My dad says you're a hero," the girl said. Brooke knelt down to her level, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 7 years of secrets finally released. "Your dad is the hero. I just did my job. She carried me when I couldn't walk," Chen told his daughter. "And she never told anyone because that's what real heroes do. They don't need recognition. They just need to know the person survived." General Morrison appeared in the doorway for a scheduled visit, reviewing the combat medic training program Brooke had developed. It was being rolled out across all VA hospitals now, her curriculum, her methods, her philosophy that medical competence transcends rank. As he left, he paused. "Master Chief, the Navy would welcome you back to active duty. Your skills are wasted in civilian life." Brooke looked at Marcus studying for his EMT certification at the training table. She looked at the medics she'd trained. She looked at the photograph of Chen. "Respectfully, sir, I'm exactly where I need to be." That evening she drove past the strip mall again. The insurance kiosk was dark, Whitfield's table empty. She didn't know if he'd clocked out for the day or clocked out for good. She didn't particularly care. At home, she found Marcus at the kitchen table with his EMT textbooks spread across the surface. "Mom," he said, "my instructor asked if you'd come speak to our class about trauma medicine." She smiled, the first real smile in months, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. "Tell him yes." The dog tags hung from her rearview mirror now, no longer hidden beneath scrubs, no longer a secret that needed keeping. They caught the light when she drove, the same way the medals in the shadow box caught light. Proof. Evidence. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If Brooke's story taught you anything, it's that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it kneels to pick up a dropped meal tray and says nothing. Subscribe to this channel to see more stories of people who were underestimated and became unstoppable. Like this video, comment with your story. Have you ever been judged and proven everyone wrong? And hit that notification bell so you don't miss when we find the next hidden hero walking among us.